The flashing red and blue lights lit up the quiet street as an elderly woman stood frozen on the sidewalk. She wasn't just any woman, she was the mother of the country's justice minister. But tonight, she wasn't being treated with respect or dignity. Instead, she found herself surrounded by officers, their voices sharp, their tone accusatory. It all started when she stepped out for a routine evening walk, something she had done countless times before. The city was familiar to her, the streets a part of her daily life. But this time, things took a turn she never expected. Out of nowhere, a patrol car pulled up, and before she could process what was happening, 2 officers approached, questioning her aggressively. Confused, she tried to explain herself, but the officers didn't seem interested in listening. They insisted she provide identification, demanding answers as if she were a suspect in some unknown crime. People walking by slowed down, whispering among themselves, but no one intervened. The woman, despite her years, held her ground, asking why she was being treated this way. But instead of answers, she got more pressure. What made this encounter even more shocking was that she wasn't just an ordinary citizen. She was the mother of the nation's justice minister, a man responsible for overseeing law and order. A man who had spent his career advocating for justice, fairness, and the protection of citizens' rights. And yet, here was his own mother, being subjected to the very abuse of power he had fought against. Word of the incident spread quickly. The news reached the justice minister within hours, and his reaction, immediate. He was furious. How could something like this happen? And more importantly, why? Was this a case of mistaken identity, or was there something more sinister at play? As the truth unraveled, the nation watched in shock. Was this just a routine misunderstanding, or was there a deeper reason behind the officer's actions? Were they targeting her deliberately? And if so, who was really behind it? What happened next left everyone speechless. Stay tuned, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. The justice minister sat in his office, his hands clenched into fists. The call had come from a close family friend who had witnessed the entire incident. His mother, an elderly woman who had never been in trouble a day in her life, had been stopped, questioned, and humiliated on the street as if she were a criminal. And for what? That was the question burning in his mind. He immediately called her, his voice calm but urgent. "Are you okay?" he asked. There was a long pause before she answered. "I'm fine," she said softly, but he could hear the tension in her voice. "I don't understand what happened. They just kept asking me questions. They wouldn't tell me why." His heart pounded. This wasn't just a random incident. He knew how things worked. A stop like this, especially one handled so aggressively, wasn't normal. He asked if she could remember any details. What were the officers' names? What did they say? Did they seem to recognize her? She hesitated before replying. "One of them, I think he knew who I was." That was all he needed to hear. This wasn't just a mistake. Someone had done this deliberately. But why? Was it a message? A warning? Or something even more calculated? That night, he barely slept. His mind raced with possibilities. As the country's justice minister, he had made enemies. People who resented his push for reforms, his crackdown on corruption, his insistence that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. Could this be retaliation? The next morning, he arrived at his office earlier than usual. His team had already gathered, aware of the situation. One of his aides pulled him aside, looking uneasy. "Sir, there's something else." A journalist called. They already know about what happened. His stomach tightened. This was bigger than he had thought. News like this didn't leak on its own. Someone wanted the public to know. Someone wanted to stir the pot. Within hours, social media was flooded with reactions. Some people were outraged. How could the mother of the justice minister be treated this way? Others questioned the real story. Was there more to the incident than what was being reported? And then there were those who saw it as a power play, an attempt to intimidate the minister himself. But the most unsettling part, the officers involved had gone silent. No statements, No explanations. Nothing. It was as if they had been ordered to disappear. She lowered her voice. A car has been parked outside for hours. It's the same one that was near me that night. His heart pounded. This wasn't just about intimidating him anymore. They were watching her, keeping tabs, maybe even waiting for the next move. Whoever was behind, this wasn't backing down. They were doubling down. He ended the call, his mind spiraling. Daniel watched him closely. "They're pushing you," he said. "They want to see if you'll back off." The minister clenched his jaw. "Then they don't know me at all." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, quiet meetings, and hushed conversations in secure locations. Trusted allies warned him to be careful, that he was stepping into something dangerous. Even some within his own office looked at him with nervous glances, as if they knew more than they were willing to say. Then, just when he thought things couldn't escalate further, a new piece of information landed on his desk. A leaked email, one that tied everything together. A name, a motive, a connection between the officers, the surveillance, and someone in a position of real power. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words. This was bigger than he imagined, and the moment he acted on it, there would be no turning back. Because now, the real battle was about to begin. The Justice Minister's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the envelope. The dim light of the parking garage cast long shadows, making the moment feel even heavier. He glanced at Daniel, whose expression was unreadable. "Where did you get this?" the minister asked, his voice low. Daniel hesitated. "Someone on the inside. They're scared, but they wanted you to see this." The minister flipped through the documents again. The surveillance footage showed his mother before the officers approached her, walking peacefully down the street. Then, almost on cue, the patrol car appeared, as if they had been waiting for her. But what struck him the most was a name scribbled on one of the internal memos. Someone high up in the chain of command had authorized this. He inhaled deeply, his mind racing. He had suspected political pressure, maybe even an attempt to rattle him. But this was a deliberate setup. Someone with real power had given the order, and they had done everything to erase the evidence. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the heavy silence. He checked the screen, his mother. He answered quickly. "Are you okay?" There was a pause before she spoke. I think someone is watching the house." The blood drained from his face. He turned away from Daniel, gripping the phone tightly. "What do you mean?" She lowered her voice. "A car has been parked outside for hours. It's the same one that was near me that night." His heart pounded. This wasn't just about intimidating him anymore. They were watching her, keeping tabs, maybe even waiting for the next move. Whoever was behind, this wasn't backing down. They were doubling down. He ended the call, his mind spiraling. Daniel watched him closely. "They're pushing you," he said. "They want to see if you'll back off." The minister clenched his jaw. "Then they don't know me at all." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, quiet meetings, and hushed conversations in secure locations. Trusted allies warned him to be careful, that he was stepping into something dangerous. Even some within his own office looked at him with nervous glances, as if they knew more than they were willing to say. Then, just when he thought things couldn't escalate further, a new piece of information landed on his desk. A leaked email, one that tied everything together. A name, a motive, a connection between the officers, the surveillance, and someone in a position of real power. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words. This was bigger than he imagined, and the moment he acted on it, there would be no turning back. Because now, the real battle was about to begin. The Justice Minister stared at the leaked email, his pulse racing. The name on it wasn't just familiar, it was someone he had trusted, someone he had worked alongside for years. A high-ranking official within his own government had been pulling the strings all along. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any stranger, a new piece of information surfaced, one that changed everything. But what it revealed was something no one was prepared for. The Justice Minister stared at his phone, his grip tightening as he scrolled through the latest news reports. Every headline, every post, every comment was adding fuel to the fire. People were demanding answers. Why was his mother harassed? Who were the officers involved? And more importantly, why was there complete silence from the police department? He had expected a response, an official statement at the very least. But instead, there was nothing. No names, no explanations. It was as if the officers had simply vanished. That, more than anything, made his gut churn. Someone was controlling the narrative, keeping a lid on the truth. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he called a trusted contact within the police force. The officer on the other end hesitated before speaking. "Sir, I don't know how much I can say over the phone, but something's off. Those officers weren't even supposed to be on duty that night." The minister's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "I mean they weren't assigned to that area. No reports were filed about any incident involving your mother. It's like it never officially happened." The words sent a chill down his spine. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover this up. But why? Was it meant to intimidate him? Or was it something bigger, something far more dangerous? Meanwhile, journalists were digging deeper. One reporter in particular, a relentless investigator named Daniel Cortez, had been reaching out to sources, piecing together details that no one else had. Late that evening, he called the minister directly. "You need to see this," Daniel said, his voice urgent. "Meet me in an hour, and come alone." The minister hesitated. He didn't trust easily, especially not when things were already spiraling out of control. But Daniel was known for exposing high-level corruption, and if he had found something, it was worth the risk. That night, they met in a quiet, dimly lit parking garage. Daniel handed him a small envelope. "I don't know how deep this goes, but those officers, they weren't acting alone." The minister opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the documents inside. What he saw made his stomach drop. Surveillance footage, internal police memos, evidence of a coordinated effort. His mother wasn't just stopped randomly, she was targeted. For the most shocking part, it seemed to trace back to someone within his own government. This wasn't just harassment. This was something far more calculated, and the deeper he looked, the more he realized he wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting against a system that wanted to silence him. And they had just made it personal. The Justice Minister's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the envelope. The dim light of the parking garage cast long shadows, making the moment feel even heavier. He glanced at Daniel, whose expression was unreadable. "Where'd you get this?" the minister asked, his voice low. Daniel hesitated. "Someone on the inside. They're scared. They wanted you to see this." The minister flipped through the documents again. The surveillance footage showed his mother before the officers approached her, walking peacefully down the street. Then, almost on cue, the patrol car appeared, as if they had been waiting for her. But what struck him the most was a name scribbled on one of the internal memos. Someone high up in the chain of command had authorized this. He inhaled deeply, his mind racing. He had suspected political pressure, maybe even an attempt to rattle him. But this was a deliberate setup. Someone with real power had given the order, and they had done everything to erase the evidence. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the heavy silence. He checked the screen, his mother. He answered quickly. "Are you okay?" There was a pause before she spoke. I think someone is watching the house." The blood drained from his face. He turned away from Daniel, gripping the phone tightly. "What do you mean?" It all made sense now. The harassment of his mother wasn't random. It wasn't just an act of intimidation. It was a message, a warning meant to keep him in check. He had been pushing too hard, digging too deep into corruption, and now the very system he was trying to fix had turned against him. He knew he had to act fast. If this person was willing to go this far, there was no telling what they would do next. He gathered his closest allies, people he knew he could trust, and laid everything out. The leaked documents, the surveillance footage, the names. It was risky, but there was no other way. If he stayed silent, they would win. Meanwhile, his mother remained under watch. The car outside her house hadn't moved. The tension was unbearable, but she refused to be afraid. "Do what you have to do," she told him over the phone. "I won't be intimidated." That night, the Justice Minister made his move. He called a press conference, something the people had been demanding for days. But instead of just addressing what had happened to his mother, he exposed everything. The corruption, the cover-up, the name behind it all. Live on national television, he laid the truth bare for the entire country to see. The fallout was immediate. The high-ranking official he named denied everything, calling it a political attack. But the evidence was too strong. Investigations were launched. Protests erupted. The pressure was unbearable. And within hours, that same official was forced to resign. But just when it seemed like justice had prevailed, an unexpected twist changed everything. The police officers involved in the harassment finally spoke out, and what they revealed turned the entire case on its head. "We were following orders," one of them admitted, "but not from who you think." The minister's breath caught. If it wasn't the person he exposed, then who? A new name emerged, someone even higher up, someone who had stayed in the shadows while letting others take the fall. This wasn't over, not even close. The real mastermind was still out there, watching, waiting. And now they knew he was coming for them. The fight for justice had only just begun. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Justice Minister's mind. He had thought the battle was over, but now it was clear. He had only scratched the surface. The real mastermind had remained hidden, using others as shields, manipulating the system from the shadows. But this time, things were different. The country was watching. The people had seen the truth unfold in real time, and there was no way to silence them now. The pressure on law enforcement grew stronger, and the investigation widened. More whistleblowers stepped forward, revealing a web of corruption that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The minister knew this fight wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. The public demanded justice. Independent journalists refused to let the story die, and even within the government, those who had once been silent began speaking out. The truth was no longer something that could be buried. As for his mother, she remained strong. The surveillance on her home disappeared overnight, and she reassured him she was safe. But as he visited her one evening, she looked at him with quiet wisdom and said, "They tried to scare us. That means they're afraid." Her words stayed with him. Fear was what had driven those in power to act so desperately. Fear of losing control. Fear of accountability. And now that fear was shifting, this time onto them. In the weeks that followed, arrests were made. Resignations piled up. The hidden mastermind was finally named, and their empire of influence collapsed. The battle had been won, but the minister knew the war against corruption would never truly be over. As he stood before a crowd at a public forum, he didn't promise that things would change overnight. Instead, he promised something more powerful: the fight would never stop. And with the people behind him, he knew that justice was no longer just an ideal. It was a movement. The system had been shaken, the truth had prevailed, and in the end, justice had found its way home.